Hi, I'm Hannah Perlman. My capstone is a case study of the Yale affiliated daycare center, Calvin Hill. Calvin Hill was founded by Yale undergraduates in 1970 to provide affordable daycare to Yale employees in the Local 35 union, like dining hall workers and maintenance staff. Today, Calvin Hill stands as a national model for high quality childcare. Calvin Hill has always maintained a sliding tuition scale. However, the bottom of the scale today is mostly occupied by graduate students and postdocs instead of union employees. Grad students and postdocs, although low income at the time, are not low social status and expect higher earnings in the near future. Despite its founding mission, almost no members of Local 35 enroll or even apply to Calvin Hill today. My project investigated why. First, I put Calvin Hill in context of childcare in the US. Segregation in childcare is a severe problem, dividing students along racial and socioeconomic lines. This segregation correlates to a difference in the quality of care. Low SES students often receive lower quality of care. Segregation and quality gaps are a problem because high quality care positively impacts outcomes for low SES students. Further, integrated classrooms provide benefits for all students. To understand changes in socioeconomic diversity at Calvin Hill, I conducted interviews with the current and former director and a historical review of Calvin Hill's board documents. I found that in the early years of Calvin Hill, it also struggled to recruit Local 35 members, but the founding board was deeply committed to serving that population and did succeed in filling about 15% of slots with union employees. And significantly, no slots were designated to faculty. The sliding tuition scale was very narrow and focused only on relatively low-income families. Over the years, Calvin Hill's mission statement has changed from providing affordable care for low-income Yale employees to include making Calvin Hill a high-quality center and a center that promotes economic diversity to serve all families. The sliding scale and providing high quality have always put a financial strain on the organization and have made it necessary to expand the sliding scale at the top and include high-income families like faculty, lawyers, and doctors. All of these changes combined resulted in a demographic shift in comparison to the founding years, with significantly more high-income and high SES families at the top of an already expanded sliding scale. Finally, I surveyed Local 35 employees and found that they overwhelmingly either have never heard of Calvin Hill, or if they had heard of it, did not know about its founding mission or the sliding tuition scale. About 44% of respondents said that after the survey, they were now interested or felt positively about Calvin Hill, which is optimistic news for potentially reintegrating them into the Calvin Hill community. If Calvin Hill chooses to re-elevate the founding mission focused on union families, my study suggests it is practical to do so. Although it would be challenging, recruiting 5 to 7 union families would be a realistic goal. Calvin Hill's board would need to fully commit itself to recruiting these families and communicate directly with union members. If Calvin Hill succeeds, union families could make a large positive impact on the Calvin Hill community.
Hi, I'm Joy. My capstone is titled Inductive Learning and Writing Proofs, Student Experiences in Advanced University Mathematics. For most of K through 12, math is largely focused on computation. You might be taught a certain rule or concept, like graphing polynomials or integrating functions, and then your job is to learn how to apply this rule to different kinds of problems. When students move deeper into the field of pure math, math takes on a different flavor. Instead of being primarily computation-based, math becomes proof-based. The focus is no longer on applying rules, but rather knowing why they're true. Proofs are core to this process. And defined more formally, a proof is a series of logical arguments which show why a certain mathematical claim is true. And writing proofs is a complex skill involving many, many different components, from your definitions and theorems, to the syntax, to the approach, to the concepts. And for a lot of students, their first encounter with proofs happens in college, which means they need to learn a new skill. And how does this happen? In many universities, Yale included, students' first exposure to proofs is in an introductory proof-based course, meaning that the curriculum is focused on a specific content area like linear algebra or analysis, and then this material is taught and rigorously justified through proofs. From my experience as a math major and as a peer tutor for one of these courses, this process isn't very well facilitated, and students have a really hard time learning proofs. Many of them don't feel like they were even taught at all or taught explicitly, which leads me to ask, how did they learn? On the side of existing research, most studies are focused on why students find it hard to understand or read proofs. So they're more focused on proof comprehension and not the learning process itself. And a lot of them are also constrained to a specific class or a specific proof, which isn't as helpful for understanding the whole process. This brings me to my research questions. First, how do students learn to write proofs, and what is the role of inductive learning? My research takes the perspective of deductive versus inductive learning to better understand how students can learn implicitly. Defined formally, deductive learning is where students are taught concepts and rules that they then learn to apply, and with inductive learning, students discover and infer rules by observing examples, usually curated by the instructor. My second research question asks about the consequences. How does the inductive teaching method shape course culture and impact students beyond just their learning? How does it impact their well-being and their confidence? Through interviews with 12 undergraduate students, I found that learning to write proofs is a primarily inductive process. The more straightforward components of proofs, things like definitions and syntax, these can be taught effectively using deductive methods. But the aspects of proofs which make them challenging, the approach, the structure, the intuition behind these, are learned and best learned inductively. Students obtain the exposure and examples necessary for effective inductive learning largely through the course homework, and not as much the lecture or direct instruction. Specifically, it's the homework problems that students are unable to prove that facilitate learning the most. By working off of hints from teaching assistants and peers, or by reconstructing a solution from the internet, students develop new insights. And rather than viewing this as copying or cheating, I found that these methods help students gain exposure to the approaches and reasoning of more experienced mathematicians, especially at the critical points where they might have been struggling, all of which is really conducive to inductive learning. An inductive approach to teaching also has certain consequences on student behavior and course culture, particularly when it's not done well. Because the inductive method places greater responsibility on the student, many become proficient at self-learning and self-study, and others make a habit of working collaboratively with their peers. On the other hand, when the learning expectations are not clear and the inductive teaching isn't sufficiently supplemented with examples of proofs for learning to take place, students turn to the internet. This creates a culture of over-dependence on online solutions, which can be discouraging and harmful to student confidence. I recommend that instructors lay out clear expectations regarding learning and online resource usage. I also recommend that they provide students with supplemental resources for completing problem sets, which gives students more opportunities to gain exposure to proof examples central to the inductive learning process. This grants students greater agency and empowers them to take control of their learning, enabling them to better learn how to write proofs. Thank you.
So my name is Emil Friedman, and I'm a senior in Solomon, and my capstone project is called Effective Principles, Effective Turnarounds. And I want to begin in New York City with something called a renewal program. So for the past 5 years, the renewal program attempted to turn around the city's most challenged schools. And by that, I mean there were 94 schools. They had abysmal academic performance, safety concerns. There's a risk of state takeover. And so through renewal, they got a massive infusion of nearly $1 billion, as well as human capital. And yet the program ended last year after no significant improvements were found across those 94 schools. But it brought this essential question that I found fascinating, which is how can we radically transform America's worst schools through policy intervention? Well, the federal government has thought about that question. And for the past 15 years, they've provided these federal turnaround models for the bottom 5% of schools. And so school districts get to pick from 4 models, and they get funding in exchange for that intervention. The first 2 models are the ones that I focused on in my project, transformation and turnaround. Those are the ones that maintain the school building. They don't transfer it to a charter school. Instead, they just reform it. And this is the option that about 95% of schools going through turnaround will choose. What I found interesting as I looked at those 2 models was that common to both was replacing the principal. In fact, turning around a school necessarily meant that you were going to replace the principal. So on one hand, you had this idea that common to almost all substantial turnaround efforts was principal replacement. But at the same time, literature says that principal longevity is a major factor in student and school success. So they kind of don't go together. So I came up with this question, which is how can we improve school turnaround outcomes through school leadership? So I conducted a literature review that surveyed and integrated discrete categories of research on turnaround and on school leadership. And there's a lot on turnaround, a lot on school leadership, and a lot less that brings those 2 bodies together. So I'm going to go through 2 buckets that I investigated. There's a lot more in the paper, but 2 major ideas. So the first regarding turnaround. So turnaround came about because the federal government recognized that the bottom 5% of America's schools account for a disproportionate amount of educational inequalities in our country. And so the federal government incentivizes school districts, or LEAs, to pick one of those 4 models that we talked about, and they get a school improvement grant for that work. And yet turnaround models give little, effectively no guidance on principal recruitment and development. The second bucket is that research suggests that principal experience and time, yes, it does matter. Principals with prior experience and long tenure in a building are associated with greater school performance. The mechanics behind that are developing a strong instructional core that's consistent over time. They build trust and they build relationships. In new schools and those with inexperienced principals, which as we know happens all the time, distributing leadership matters. So from those findings, we can identify best practices for turnaround principles. The first is that especially in turnaround situations, relevant experience matters. The second is that trust and culture building takes time and concerted effort. And the third is that principals need to be in a turnaround school for the long run, at least 3 years, ideally much more. And implementation can lie at the federal level. In order to be approved for turnaround, there should be a clear recruitment plan developed by the district to recruit a familiar principal for that school's context. There should be structured, distributed leadership practices to build trusting culture throughout the building. And finally, there should be incentivized retention of turnaround principals through bonuses, like the Bronx Plan, which pays bonuses to teachers in hard-to-staff schools. We know that leadership is just one part of successful turnaround, but it is within our control. It's one of those few factors in schools that is within our control. There's a lot more to this, and I'd love to talk more with you about it. Shoot me an email with any questions, comments, and we can talk further. And finally, as I'm graduating, I would like to thank a few people in groups. So first, Mira Debs, who's been a great advisor and a good friend of mine throughout my time at Yale. TZB and Ann Mishkin, who both were really helpful in editing my project. Richard Lemons and Bill Garfinkel, who were both amazing ed studies professors in other seminars. And finally, my education studies colleagues who helped create this great community of people who all care about equity and access in public education. So thank you.